Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, who previously served as the Director of the German Marshal Fund's Berlin office. Welcome to Background Briefing, Constanze Stelzenmüller.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining us. And there's a front page article in today's Los Angeles Times as Capitol Riot anniversary nears, Western allies fear for health of U.S. democracy. And you're quoted in the article saying, it's becoming clear to everyone that January the 6th wasn't just an isolated episode. It was part of something larger, more deeply rooted and more pernicious. So expand on that, if you will, Constanze.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that I'm your best witness for that, since I'm a German living in Washington, D.C. I think it is the work of the January 6th Commission has made it extremely clear that there was a run-up, a planning, strategic intent to these endeavors, that this wasn't just a spontaneous riot. But
how would it compare then to a similar constituency, I'm assuming, in Germany, like the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland?
I'm sorry, well, how do you mean?
Well, is it a small percentage of the American body politic? In other words, if European leaders and analysts are concerned of the fate of American democracy, and then in November, the Stockholm-based European think tank, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, for the first time put the U.S. on a list of backsliding democracies. So the concern is out there, but it's also the resurgence of far-right parties.
Right. Okay.
It's a phenomenon across Europe as well, isn't it?
So there are different things going on here. Again, I think really Americans don't need the Germans or the Swedes to tell them about the state of their democracy. In that LA Times article, answered questions. And the questions, I haven't seen the article yet, but I was asked particularly about European and German reactions to January 6th and how that has shaped policy. I don't think I'm your best source on what is, actually happening here and how America should be. I'm not here to lecture Americans. Okay. And yes, it is absolutely true that there are right-wing movements all across Europe. The difference is that America has two parties, and that it has, and that one of those two parties is visibly, steadily radicalizing, and that its base appears to believe have significant overlap in its beliefs with that of the insurgents of January 6th. In other words, in Germany, to take my own country, the right-wing radicals do play a role, but they are, relatively speaking, and I emphasize the word relatively here, politically marginal at 10-point-something% of the vote in the last national elections.
Well, there's a report that recently, in a conversation with Vice President Kamala Harris, that Angela Merkel, who's retired, of course, somewhat plaintively asked Vice President Harris, what is happening to America? So if that's true, then, in other words, people looking from the outside quite often have a very useful perspective. There's a Canadian political scientist who's concerned that by 2030, the United States will be a dictatorial country. So to my mind, these perspectives are useful. Sometimes we can't see what's happening to ourselves.
Right. Again, I really want to emphasize this, that I think Americans are perfectly capable of looking at their own country with clear eyes. I mean, there are people like the historian Daniel Ziblatt, Timothy Snyder, a host of people, Anne Applebaum, who have written with great clarity and urgency about this. My colleague at Brookings, Jonathan Rauch, just wrote a fantastic book called The Constitution of Knowledge, where he diagnoses in a very even-handed way something that he calls an epistemological civil war that's going on in America. It's certainly true that for Europeans, we're looking at a darkening security environment in Europe. We've just come through 4 years of Trump. The bridge between Trump and the Biden administration was the January 6th insurrection, if you will, which ended with the calling of the election for Biden. But there is I mean, it's become very clear that European governments, not just the one in Germany, have looked at this over the past 5 years now and said, clearly we're better off with people who treat us as allies rather than as sort of hostile elements. But looking at the current politics of America, we might have to develop a strategy that is composed in equal parts of cooperation with the Biden administration and hedging against a return of Trumpism in whatever shape or form.
Well, in terms of the return of Trumpism, your colleague there at Brookings, Fiona Hill, I spoke with her recently, and she said that if Trump comes back in 2024 based on a lie, a fiction, it's game over for American democracy. So I assume that the Europeans would be incredibly alarmed at that prospect, because Trump just endorsed Orban in his re-election in Hungary.
Yes, indeed. Well, Fiona, if I might say, has also written an admirable book about this. If you'll allow me a sort of an ad blip for my colleague. It's called There's Nothing for You Here, in which she's written about this in great detail. But the reason why this is, why the radicalization of the GOP and the continued belief of millions of Americans that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump is so alarming is precisely that the Kremlin appears to be eyeing political division in America and the potential fragility of the transatlantic political connection, and seeing an opportunity there that it could exploit by reclaiming a Russian sphere of influence. That, I think, is what the outrageous demands that the Kremlin laid out just before New Year's are about. They're basically, as Vladimir Putin full well knows, completely unacceptable for Western governments. And I think the point here is to sow dissension, weaken Western resolve and cohesion, and to make political gains at a time when actually Putin and the Kremlin himself are in many ways weakened by the energy situation, by inflation, and by a rampant COVID crisis within Russia.
Well, they've got Tucker Carlson on Fox News cheering for Putin and echoing his propaganda vis-a-vis Ukraine. But surely from the beginning, if you go back to 2016 and Putin's efforts to help elect Trump, he probably thought, like everybody else, that Hillary might have won. But Putin had it covered, because if Hillary would have won, Trump to this day would be running around organizing rallies of lock her up, and stop the steal. So Trump is the gift that keeps on giving as far as Putin's concerned. And surely the idea of Trump coming back is indeed game over for America, but a huge win for Putin.
As I've said, yes.
Yeah. Well, just in the last minute here, what can we do to avoid this outcome? We seem to have a GOP that would rather cheat than compete. Even as we speak today, it looks like Senator Manchin's not going to cooperate in terms of changing filibuster rules, so there probably won't be any laws protecting the next election. So it seems to be happening in plain sight here. Are we sleepwalking into some kind of catastrophe?
Mr. Masters, again, I'm a German citizen who's a guest in this country.
Right.
It's a country I'm very fond of. I've lived here as a child and then as a graduate student and now again as an adult for the past 8 years. And I have watched the radicalization and the polarization of American politics with dismay. And I've also watched, because I'm a constitutional lawyer by training and once in another century wrote my German doctoral thesis on American constitutional law, I have watched conservatives in particular, radical conservatives, question American constitutional values in ways that are, to me, profoundly shocking. And that to my father, who was a 17-year-old German POW back in 1944-45, and who was very grateful for having been rescued by the Americans, would have been even more shocking. But again, America is a grown-up country. I have some faith in America's ability to reinvent itself. It's done that many times, and one can only hope that it finds the energy and the strength again to do that once more. But I say that in the full consciousness that a great deal depends on this, and not least the security of Europe and of my own country. And so I have, like I think many people who have very warm feelings about this country. I'm watching this with bated breath, with anxiety, and keeping my fingers crossed.
Well, I thank you for joining us. I appreciate your perspective. I really do.
You're very welcome. May everything go.
Well, thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Constanze Stelzenmüller, who's a Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, who has previously served as the director of the German Marshal Fund's Berlin office. We're going to take a brief station break. We'll be back with the author of a new book out today, The Next Civil War, Dispatches from the American Future.